Good afternoon. I'm Professor Shane Dark, and welcome to the weekly NDART webinar, broadcast, as you know, live from the ballrooms of Mars, where I can assure you, only last week arcade fire was seen on the dance floor. This is true. Now, while we are widely dispersed, we acknowledge traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Look, today it's a real pleasure both to introduce our speaker and the topic. Our speaker is Associate Professor Peter Kelly of the School of Psychology at the University of Wollongong. Peter's a clinical psychologist, Director of the Centre for Health Psychology Practice and Research. His research focuses on the development, implementation and evaluation of evidence-based approaches within mental health and substance-dependent treatment. Now, the topic being addressed in this webinar, residential rehabilitation, is one of the great importance to our field. And on a personal level, over the decades, I've had the great pleasure to work with such excellent organisations as We Help Ourselves, Odyssey House and Kadesh, amongst others, and witness the exceptional work that they do. Residential rehab is one of the two major treatment modalities in alcohol and other drug treatment, and the primary one for the treatment of dependence on drugs such as methamphetamine. Indeed, it's the resi rehabs have borne the brunt of the methamphetamine epidemic, the challenges that has evolved over the last 20 years. In this presentation, Peter will highlight the evidence based underpinning residential rehabilitation treatment and discuss future research directions. Now, of course, for full details of this work, you should read Peter's papers on the topic. Now, you can ask your questions on the Q&A function, and I'll present them to Peter at the end of the presentation. I may not be able to ask them all, as we have a very large audience today, but I'll most certainly endeavour to do so. So with no more from me, now, Peter, it's over to you.
Thanks, Shane. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to present at this seminar. But I think, like most people, I've always really appreciated and respected the work at NDARC, and really happy to contribute to it through this webinar today. So, as Shane said, my name's Pete Kelly. I'm from the University of Wollongong. I'm going to do my best to provide a presentation on residential rehabilitation. I've tried to, rather than to go into any particular study in a lot of detail, I've tried to provide an overview and cover a bit of territory. So hopefully that all works. I've also included some references throughout some descriptions of the articles. And if anyone wants copies of anything, just email me, and happy to send you the slides or happy to send you any of the papers. Just to, like to expand on what Shane was just saying. Would like to absolutely acknowledge we're meeting on Aboriginal land today. I'm down here in the Illawarra. I would really like to welcome any Aboriginal people that might be watching this webinar today. Likewise, I'd like to just give a really big thank you to the non-government sector, I guess more broadly, and these organisations. These are services that I'll either be talking about directly today, or some of the work that I'll be presenting today involves some of these organisations. I think the hope when you're doing any kind of applied research with organisations is that it's valuable and it's useful and offers some sort of meaningful contribution. But I absolutely appreciate doing research with any active organisations. Puts a level of burden and hassle and whatnot in the organisations. I just wanted to say thank you to the staff and the clients and the management who have been really supportive of our work, but obviously lots of people's work over the years. While I'm thanking people and acknowledging people, I'll try and do my best to flag who's been involved in different projects as I'm going through the presentation. But just wanted to highlight Senior Professor Frank Dean, who's recently, I guess you'd call him semi-retired at this stage. He's been involved in, I think, nearly all of the projects that I'm going to be talking about today, and is obviously a source of incredible a wealth of knowledge. Likewise, Amanda Baker, I think we dragged her into doing research specifically on residential programs, but she's stuck with the team and is obviously has a wealth of knowledge across the whole of the Dictioner field that we've really appreciated. And likewise, Mr. Jared Burns. So we've done a lot of research with the Salvation Army, and Jared has really helped to facilitate, help to source funding, support students, and get projects off the ground. It's been, I think he's really championed research, particularly in the non-government residential drug and alcohol service, and couldn't be more appreciative of his support over the years. So Kadesh Rehabilitation Services, this is where it really starts for me. So I did undergraduate psychology at down here at the University of Wollongong, and graduated, and really I wasn't sure where I'd work. I didn't think I had a lot of skills to really offer any sort of health service, but I'm really appreciative that one of my lecturers, Jessica Granger, suggested that I volunteer some time at Kadesh and start my registration process in terms of becoming a psychologist. And so my first job in the industry was working at this drug and alcohol service. And I worked there for a number of years, firstly as a volunteer, and then ultimately got into paid positions. I did the night shifts. I ran the groups, helped transport clients everywhere. And I still reflect back on those times as just being incredibly important in terms of shaping, I guess, who I am as a psychologist, but also like how I approach research. It's a field that I think I've always valued. I'm not quite sure what it is about residential treatment. I can't quite put my finger on it. I enjoy the client population group. Visiting any rehab, I really like talking to the people. But likewise, I like the staff. I think there's something about the commitment and the desire to, wanting to do something, meaningful and making an impact, I think really goes through that workforce. And, obviously they're the people you want to collaborate with and work with. So I've always appreciated the sector. So let me begin by just providing some background context around residential rehabilitation and what some of the evidence is. There's a couple of really good reviews that I'd encourage you, and you can see the references here. And once again, happy to send people the slides. But the Matilda Centre did a really nice review commissioned by NADA, providing an overview of residential research and treatment, summarising systematic reviews that have been conducted in the field, and doing a bit of consultation with service providers and people with lived experience around the process. And likewise, Dom and Leanne Hydes and the group up at the University of Queensland put together a really nice systematic review looking at residential drug and alcohol treatment as well. So I'd encourage you to have a look at those. And my next couple of slides are really pulling from both of those documents. So these are the major bylines in terms of residential rehab from these reviews. So in the systematic review, their conclusion was that there's moderate quality evidence, the effectiveness of residential treatment in improving outcomes across a number of substance use and life domains. And likewise from the Matilda Centre review, overall residential treatment was associated with significant reductions in alcohol and other drug use, symptoms of mental ill health, criminal activity, and other psychosocial outcomes. So when we're looking at big picture, there's evidence around residential treatment, and it tends to be supportive of the role of residential treatment, which is encouraging for the sector. In saying that, when you look at the research around residential treatment, all of the reviews, including those two, there's always a sentence sort of saying caution, like interpret the results with caution. And I think that's because it's a really tricky area to do research in, and particularly to do those big studies that we all want, looking at the ultimate effectiveness of something. So I think here's, I guess, a bit of a summary of the challenges. There's a lot of variability in the services. So the services vary in length, they vary in the different types of treatment modalities that are being delivered. Lots of disparities in terms of funding and resources that are available to different services. So often you'd be kind of comparing cats with dogs or apples with oranges. And the client population groups across different settings really vary. And sometimes that's specific. So a service might be set up specifically just to work with, women and children, for example. But other times services just get a name for working with, more, clinical presentations or, people with co-occurring mental health problems or whatever it is. I think the other challenge with doing research around residential is that there's relatively high rates of attrition. So it's difficult to look at sort of like people who are getting like a sufficient dose of treatment. And that makes sense. It's a huge commitment to go and live in a residential program for quite a long period of time. It's also incredibly difficult to follow up people who are leaving residential treatment. And the short, you can do it, but it's just a very expensive exercise to get anywhere near respectable follow-up rates. People are often transient when they're coming into residential treatment. They don't necessarily have telephone numbers, or they change. Often they've burnt bridges or don't have close contacts with the people that they might eventually be ending up in once they leave. So it's difficult to do that. And likewise, there's some real difficulties around randomization and how you do conduct randomized control trials within these settings. And I'll try and allude to a little bit of that as I'm going through the presentation. There's some outstanding research questions, and these are really highlighted in those reviews and previous reviews that have come before it. But one of the big questions is which treatment modality is the best within residential treatment. And my understanding of the literature is there just isn't a clear consensus that similar outcomes seem to be produced from different treatment modalities. I think partly because I'm fortunate that I've got to visit lots of residential services, and they are different. So if you visit different centres, there's a different feeling when you go there. There's different rules. There might be, one might be doing sort of CBT, DBT, others might be 12 steps, some might be more therapeutic community, et cetera, et cetera. And so there are striking differences, and I think the experience of treatment can be different. However, I think there's a lot of commonality between them. Like most centres have groups. The role of sort of being supported by other residents and people in the facility is there. Just being offered a bed and meals and being able to get into routines, et cetera, et cetera. So whilst I think those studies are important, I think it's going to be kind of difficult to tease out the differences between different treatment modalities, because I think there's a lot of overlap. Another area that's, it'd be great to have the answers and it's not quite there yet, is around optimal length of treatment. So there are some guidelines that sort of suggest roughly between sort of 2 to 3 months might be suggestions, but there isn't clear or strong evidence around optimal length of treatment. When they do studies looking at sort of correlational studies, or where they're predicting who has done better or worse for particular programs, usually the longer people have stayed in treatment and actually completing treatment is associated with better outcomes. But once again, all of the services are slightly different lengths. It can range anywhere from sort of 1 month through to 12 months. So it's an important research question to answer, but I'm not quite sure where we're just there yet. I think the other important area is around what types of people might be better suited to different types of residential treatment, or residential treatment in the first place, or some other type, or different programs. There just isn't evidence. In terms of these bottom two, that's what I'm going to try and tackle as part of this presentation today. So in both of the reviews, they sort of highlight that there's just a lack of randomized control trials looking at aftercare and what happens to people after treatment. Coincidentally, we've just finished a big randomized control trial of a continuing care intervention. So I'll talk about some of those results. I'm not sure the definitive conclusions are going to be drawn from this presentation, but I'll show you what we've got. And I think the other challenge is around the active ingredients. Like, what are the bits and pieces within a program that have the most benefit? And obviously being able to identify that means you could replicate that across other services and maybe drop away other things that are a bit superficial. But it's an incredibly difficult thing to conduct well-developed studies to look at those ingredients. But I'll talk about how we've developed a program of research to try and come around some of those challenges. So let me move on to continuing care or aftercare. I guess the terms tend to be used pretty interchangeably, but I think continuing care is increasingly being kind of recognised as the term to use. it's almost universal if you look at practice guidelines for residential treatment of the importance of making sure that when people leave those facilities, that they are able to access other things. And that might be mutual support, it might be other counselling or support around health needs, but it could also be around housing or a whole broad range of issues. For our study, so this is a study, and really big thank you to New South Wales Health who funded this study. We conducted some research in collaboration with the Salvation Army and We Help Ourselves. And we were really interested in whether or not we could deliver a telephone delivered continuing care intervention for people after they left these residential programs. It was quite a structured approach. So we used a protocol that was developed by Jim McKay, who's based over at the University of Pennsylvania. And none of it's rocket science. It's really around goal setting, checking in with people, identifying high-risk situations, helping people to anticipate what might be coming up during the week, encouraging attendance at mutual support, and doing that on a regular basis. For our study, we had 3 treatment conditions. So we had a control arm, a 4-session arm, and a 12-session arm. For all 3 conditions, before they left the residential program, they sat down with a continuing care worker and developed a continuing care plan, which had a sort of an aspect of relapse prevention in there, but also helped the person really to think about what things might they need when they leave the residential facility, what services might they be able to access, what might be some helpful behaviours, etc., etc. So everyone did that. And then for the people in the 12-session and the 4-session arm, once they were randomised for the 4-session, they got 4 telephone sessions over a 1-month period. And for the people in the 12-session arm, they were offered 12 sessions over a 3-month period. So in terms of the design, or a bit more detail, so as I said, we did it all with the Salvation Army and WHO's. We employed continuing care workers to work on the study. They were all based and actually technically employed by the organisation, so by Salvos and We Help Ourselves. And they were all people that came from their workforce, who took some time out of the workforce to be involved in this project. And then the research team spent some time training them and providing ongoing clinical supervision. We did all of the assessments at Wollongong and obviously followed consort procedures and guidelines. This is a study flow for the trial. We do have a paper that describes this study flow and looks at what predicts whether or not people will engage in continuing care. I'm not going to get into that today, but if you're interested, I'm very happy to send you through that paper. But just a few things I wanted to flag in terms of the study flow. When we presented this idea of offering people telephone calls after they left residential treatment, about 90% interest rate. So people were really keen and could see some value as part of that process. Ultimately, we recruited 400 people who completed the baseline and the consent and the continuing care plan. And there's a dropout of about 91 people in this process. It's more methodological rather than sort of being issues with the intervention or the participants. We were quite slow in terms of recruiting, and then we're just kind of doing those assessments as the one continuing care worker at each site could get through them. So most of those people had kind of left during that period. Of those 400 people, we then tried to contact them after they left the residential program. And so we had a window of about 2 to 3 weeks that we would contact people, and they also had our contact details. And we were able to contact 277 people. So about 70%, 69, 70% of people that we could contact after rehab. We were happy with that. I'm not sure if it's a high number or a low number, but that was sort of the benchmark we were working towards. We thought, people are going to go on to other treatment or other rehabs, or maybe get engaged with forensic systems or whatever. So 70% seemed like a reasonable benchmark for us. They ultimately randomized into 3 conditions, and we're able to follow up 77% of the people that were randomized, which we were pleased with. In terms of fidelity to the intervention, the number of sessions that were completed by participants, it's sort of a pass mark, but it's on the lower side of the pass mark. So of the 12 session condition, about 5 sessions on average were completed, and about 2.5 of the 4 sessions were completed, and might help to explain some of the results we're about to have a look at. In terms of the continuing care workers, they did a great job. So all of their sessions were audio recorded, independently rated, and looked at for fidelity, as you do in these types of studies. And it was really high, the level of fidelity. So in terms of the feasibility of delivering something like this, really high, which was good. In terms of the results, and you'll hear me say this a few times as part of this presentation, people tend to improve in residential treatment. And so ultimately what we found is people across all 3 conditions improved and maintained those improvements at 6 months. So this is just looking at one of our primary outcomes. That's looking at complete abstinence. And you can see in terms of the odds ratios that people in the 12 session arm, there was a greater odds ratio that they would be abstinent at follow-up. And you can see the trend kind of follows down to the 4 session control. So it's kind of looking okay. But in terms of statistical significance, it just wasn't there. I'm just presenting here complete abstinence, but we had a whole range of secondary outcome measures that looked at things outside of drug and alcohol use, and just a really kind of consistent pattern that it didn't look like the intervention had, it didn't have an effect over the control condition. So in terms of just some reflections on this study, and we're just in the process of trying to get this published, get it completed and submitted. The results, they don't support the broader dissemination of an intervention like this across all rehabs, across all treatment episodes, which of course we were hoping might be the case at the beginning of the study. In terms of just some of the learnings, I think what became really apparent is that people for all conditions access ongoing aftercare and continuing care options. And I think the residential programs do a really good job at encouraging people, particularly to access 12-step type Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. So that was really widely endorsed. But likewise, they accessed a range of other services that were relevant to their needs. Likewise, some people just didn't need the telephone calls. You would call them up and they were doing okay, or they'd linked into their own services and things were kind of rolling. And that was happening for people in the treatment and the control condition. This last bullet point isn't really endorsed by the results, but it's more my hunch of having done this study. I think actively checking in with participants after they leave residential treatment is a really sensible thing to do. I think our results don't really support, kind of making or encouraging everyone to do ongoing continuing care. But I suspect that there's a subset of people that it's particularly beneficial for, and probably if they don't have those services or supports in their local region. It's particularly good as a safety net. So we certainly called a lot of people who were really struggling. And I'm glad that we could call them, proactively help to support them, get them back into treatment or whatever the situation involved. So there's some information on continuing care. I'm happy to send you any of the papers that we've written or developed so far. I now wanted to tackle this idea of active ingredients of treatment. And this is a really tricky thing to do. We've run some randomized controlled trials in the past where we've tried to reduce depression in residential rehab, or we've tried to make some sort of tinker around different aspects, and the results just get washed out because people in these programs get so many groups and so much support that everyone seems to improve. I think one way to approach this, and this is something we have had a bit of success at, is to try and think through in rehabs, what are the areas where they're just not having an impact? What are the areas where not much is happening? And from a research perspective, can we do something about it? What really stuck out for us was smoking. So smoking, we would do lots of surveys of people attending residential programs. We'd follow them up 12 months later. We'd talk to them all the way through. Smoking rates just wouldn't change. And so depending on the study, anywhere between sort of 75% to 90% of people reported that they were smoking, and it just didn't change. And so ambitiously, we thought, oh, I wonder if we can do something about that in residential treatment. So we developed this thing called Healthy Recovery, which was an 8-session group-based program. It really built off some of the work that Amanda Baker had completed with mental health populations. And so the focus of it was both to look at smoking, but also to think a bit more holistically and think about physical activity and diet. And, we're interested in whether or not people in residential treatment would be interested in it. And then obviously, would it have an effect? There is an outcomes paper from this. So once again, just let me know if you want the slides or me to send it out. In terms of the study design, we recruited 172 people across Salvation Army sites. Once again, thank you to the Salvation Army. We used a step wedge randomized control design, and it's just a pragmatic decision. It's really difficult to do a randomized intervention when people are like literally sleeping in beds next to each other or rooms next to each other. There's just that chance of contamination. And there's also just that idea of kind of justice, like offering something to some people and not offering it to other, and that they're living together. So we used a step wedge approach, which seemed to work well. We delivered the 8 sessions over a 5-week period, and we went out and ran the interventions with drug and alcohol workers at the sites. I think what was really encouraging and easily the scariest part of the study was, would people sign up? So we know if we interview people in rehab, their motivation to quit smoking is pretty high. Their confidence to quit smoking is incredibly low. And so when you ask people, what's your intention? They'll often say, yes, I want to quit smoking, but in 6 months' time or at some point in the future. And we were trying to recruit people for a study that's kind of right now. And so we're really encouraged that we're able to get about 76% of the population. And I don't think it was the smoking that drew them in. I think it was the diet and physical activity. In fact, we'd have people come up and say, look, we're not touching our smoking, but yeah, I do want to lose a bit of weight, or I do want to eat a bit better. So I think the healthy lifestyle approach, I think, was useful. In terms of just some of the results, what was really encouraging is people in the healthy recovery condition were much more likely to use nicotine replacement therapy compared to people that were in the control condition, or you call it the pre-intervention condition in this type of design. So much more likely to use nicotine replacement therapy, which was great. Sorry, I probably should have included some statistics on this slide, but as you can see, the red line are people that did healthy recovery. There are significant reductions in the number of cigarettes people were reporting smoking. These were statistically significant at 2 months and at 5 months, and I think at 8 months it was just marginal. What's kind of bizarre is the control conditions number of cigarettes smoked continued to decrease, and I'm not sure why. I wonder if it's just doing the assessments and people asking about smoking somewhat regularly maybe got them thinking about it. I don't know. And then in terms of quit rates, you can see that people doing healthy recovery, about 18% at the end of the intervention compared to 2%, similar trend across our follow-up points. And they were verified by people blowing into those carbon monoxide readers. So just wanted to show that, I guess, that this is an intervention that does have some effectiveness. It's been trialed in residential services here in Australia. It's free to use. We've got all of the resources on our website, all the videos, everything. People are more than welcome to use it. But likewise, for researchers that might be watching this, just thinking through, I think these are the types of designs that work well in residential treatment when you're trying to address something that's just clearly not getting addressed. Try to address something better is tricky in terms of finding significant results. Just wanted to flag, just more to showcase their work more than anything, just some PhD students who are doing some ongoing work around physical care in residential treatment. So it's Taylor Deegan is pulling together a really impressive body of research around health literacy and the importance of health literacy, particularly in drug and alcohol populations. So this study literally just came out today, published today, that looks at some of the continuing care data and looks at service utilization in the 12 months before they came into treatment and health literacy, but she's also doing some prospective work. Melvin here is really interested in diabetes risk communication in drug and alcohol treatment. So he's conducted a series of studies and has developed an intervention, always with the idea of this is something that might be good in residential treatment, about firstly measuring diabetes risk for this group. And as you might guess, the risk of diabetes is much higher in this population compared to general populations. So he's developed an intervention around how to improve that risk communication and help to shape some of those behaviours. And Bryony Osborne is doing a series of studies with St Vincent de Paul and Kadesh and a whole range of services. She's really interested in the idea of what can drug and alcohol workers do to help facilitate health interventions and help improve the health of the population, facilitate referrals and engagement. So yeah, a few papers there. I just wanted to also flag Isabella Ingram. So she recently completed her PhD, and such a timely topic, loneliness, in terms of, I guess, the context of COVID. But she's got a really impressive sort of series of studies. But I wanted to highlight this one. She co-developed with Kath Haslam and Jen Dingle up at the University of Queensland an intervention called Groups for Belongings, which is really focused on loneliness and has been trialed in residential programs. So far, I think it's just sort of pilot and feasibility work, but Jen Dingle's helping to continue some of that work. All right, the last big issue that I wanted to talk about was person-centered care, and I think that this is a really important issue in residential treatment, and hopefully that comes through in some passion in my next little bit of a presentation. So this is a quote from the Matilda Centre review, where they did some interviews with people with lived experience, and I'll just read it out. Consumer representatives noted that people come to residential treatment with a diverse range of needs, interests, skills, and capabilities. And as such, residential treatment programs need to be broad and flexible and allow residents to take part in activities that they enjoy and also have the skills for, which I just think is a really well phrased and good description of what you would hope residential treatment services were doing. I think historically, a criticism that you could make of residential treatments was that they were a bit sort of like a one-stop, one-size-fits-all approach for people, and maybe a little inflexible and very clear rules. And if you went outside of those rules, I think there's been changes, and I'm not sure it's fair to categorize residential treatments in that way now. But historically, that's been the case. I think where the field's moving to, and I think it's sort of picked up in that quote, is this idea around person-centered care. And none of this is new. This is sort of what's recommended by World Health Organizations and New South Wales Health and et cetera, et cetera. But it's this idea of really responding to the individual needs of individuals. If you think about, so if we go back to Kadesh, where I kind of cut my teeth, it was, I'm sure we did respond to individual needs when we were there, but there was an aspect of that one size fits all. There were very kind of clear rules. If you cross those rules, you were kicked out. People had to call up every day to make sure that they're on the waiting list, et cetera, et cetera. And there's been a move in the field, and what's been really nice is a move that I think has been championed by Kadesh around considering how you put person-centered care approaches into residential treatment. So in about 2016, I think, Mark Buckingham and the team at Kadesh really got together and started thinking, how can we be a bit more flexible? Like, how can we respond to the individual needs? If people need to stay longer, is that possible? How do we support people on waiting lists who are trying to come in and are our clients kind of from when they first contacting our service? So they went through and they've been sort of grappling with that as an idea. And we were funded by New South Wales Health a couple of years ago now to evaluate it. And we kind of took the approach of a bit like a feasibility study. I was really interested in, could they actually do it? Like, were the practices and processes actually in place? And it was so refreshing to meet with the staff and meet with the clients who could really articulate and provide like really concrete examples of how Kadesh, was tailoring their program and really adapting to the needs of the individuals. I think it's one thing to sort of hear presentations and see policy and procedures, but to see people give sort of real life practical examples was great. So I'm not going to go into depth around that, but there are other webinars that we've done that we could link people to if you're interested. In terms of this idea around patient-centered care, Esther Davis, who works with us, did a systematic review sort of somewhat recently in collaboration with the staff at Kadesh as part of that project. And what she found was that there was a small but consistent correlation between client-centered care and outcomes. And that's what you would hope, and that makes sense. Not to get too preachy, but I think we've also just got a ethical or a human rights, I think there's a reason that we want to be providing the best care that we can for drug and alcohol clients. I think they're a sort of a highly stigmatized group who, suffer a lot of stigma. And I think when we're providing services, we want to value people and ensure that we're meeting their individual needs. And I think that's what a paper like this sort of helps to focus. At the moment, most drug and alcohol services rely on satisfaction measures, but there aren't a lot of measures that look at the experience, that really kind of capture the journey or what's involved in treatment. So we had a go at doing it. A student, Kate Hinsley, who was a clinical master's student, was really interested in this idea of developing a patient-reported experience measure that could be used in addiction treatment. And her approach, it's this paper up here, it was a lovely approach. She used some theory and looked at what's been written about patient-reported experience, developed some interview questions, and then ultimately went out to these residential programs across New South Wales and did interviews and really talked to people about what they appreciate, what they don't appreciate about residential treatment. And they're brutally honest when you ask people in those facilities what they think. If they love it, they'll let you know, and if they hate it, they'll let you know. But it was a great way to do that. Ultimately, Kate took those interviews, developed some questions, about 33 questions, I think it was, took it back out to those people at the facilities, consulted with other drug and alcohol workers and managers, and then ultimately sort of came up with this paper. More recently, we've kind of carried the torch on for Kate and have done some psychometric evaluations of the pre-mat. It's whittled down to 23 items, and it's got sort of six domains. Free to use. If anyone's interested in having a look at it, you're more than welcome to. I think what I like about it is it's developed specifically for residential drug and alcohol services, and so it's getting at the concepts that I can still remember that the people talking about of what was important to them in their treatment. Just lastly, I just wanted to provide some broader suggestions for the sector, or some recommendations. I've already covered some of those as I've been going through this presentation, but I think the focus on the experience of residents, I just think that's a really important thing to do. And I think that's how the field will continue moving ahead. As I said before, I think really just checking in with people after they're leaving these residential programs, I think is an important activity. It's an activity that's not funded to drug and alcohol services. There's funding's very contained to what they're providing in the residential services, but I think trying to provide some sort of link after people leave treatment is important. And the last thing in terms of service providers, I haven't really got into this very much as part of this presentation, but services collect so much data, and funding bodies, and they're often funded by like 3 or 4 different funding bodies, and they all ask them to collect different amounts of data. It's ginormous. I think my recommendation would be to use the data that you're collecting in a meaningful way. So really use that as part of your individual care, but also consider it as part of some broader benchmarking activities or looking at how your service is going. I just wanted to highlight this paper. This was a paper that we wrote with NADA, and it's around analyzing and kind of crunching and looking at all of the data that's within the NADA base. But we also provide some instructions and some suggestions in here around what might be some approaches to benchmarking your own services and seeing how they're going. I think that idea of kind of continuous quality improvement is really important. And then very lastly, this is my last slide. I wasn't sure if people kind of with lived experience or family members or whatever dial into these webinars. But if you're thinking about accessing residential treatment, or you're supporting someone else to access residential treatment, just thought I'd provide a couple of suggestions. My first suggestion would be look into different services. They have different feels, they have different treatment approaches, different lengths, etc., etc. Do some research, get onto some websites, call the services, and try and find one that sort of seems to fit to your needs, and obviously talk to the staff there and get some advice. If you've been to residential treatment and it wasn't the greatest experience for you, try again, but think about trying a different residential program. I think you'll notice there's quite a bit of variety in how they're delivered, and what might be perfect for you might not be great for someone else, and vice versa. And the last point is residential treatment isn't the only option. I think often GPs and doctors are kind of keen to refer people straight into residential treatment, but there's a range of other drug and alcohol treatment options are available. So talk to drug and alcohol professionals and get some advice. That's it. That's it for me. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it back over to Shane.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. I'll get you to press the green button. Well done. That's what happens when I'm not allowed near a button. That was an excellent presentation, and Michael Farrell says super presentation, Peter. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.
We've got some very good questions here. Eric Allen's asked, going back to when you're looking at outcome, the processes within a community, said, what about the measurement of fraternity and how important is that?
Sorry, what did you say? The measurement
measurement of fraternity, like fraternity within the community. Could we look at that? Is that a relevant factor, is the question Eric's asking?
Yeah, I don't totally understand the question. Are we talking about how connected that they are to people outside of the community, like people outside?
I don't think it's clear. I suppose at the time you were talking about treatment within, so let's just restrict it to, do you think a sense of fraternity and community is important during the treatment process?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, without question. And so approaches like therapeutic communities and modified therapeutic communities, they really value that. But even drug and alcohol services that wouldn't call themselves therapeutic communities, that's still an important part. When the study that I was just talking about that Kate did around the pre-mat, interviewing people, they talked about this idea of kind of feeling accepted and supported by other people in the program as just being like vital, really, really important. And I know it's sort of off the mark, but I think that's how mutual support groups are most effective. I think it's that connection to the other people in the group. I think some of the tasks and activities are a bit secondary to that sort of cohesion and that connection. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's a very good question, Eric. Nat Gerard has got a question going back to looking, I think, at your health outcomes. Were any of the rehabs non-smoking? And I wonder if smoking status, given that practically everyone who goes in smokes, is that an issue in the treatment setting, Peter?
Yeah, so smoking continues to be an issue. So there's residential services that kind of are slowly transitioning through to smoke-free. So I think there's a substantial number that are smoke-free now. When we conducted those studies, they weren't smoke-free, which kind of gave you an opportunity to do a drug and alcohol study in a controlled condition, but where people could still smoke cigarettes.
Yes.
There is evidence around smoke-free facilities, but I appreciate it's kind of a contentious issue as well.
But still, one of the things that I think you've emphasised, and certainly something that stood out to me, is the difference between a setting like a resi rehab is the holistic approach to the life and substance use and broader issues. So this fits very neatly into a program, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that's what people value. I think that's ultimately why people stay in residential programs, is that holistic approach.
There's a couple of things. Question here. Dan and Tran's got a question. What's the length of stay? Is it 12 weeks? Can people stay longer than 12 weeks? That's variable, isn't it? I mean, I know whose has 3, 6. You can stay long. It depends on the program. There are some 28-day programs. the ones you were looking at, were they typically your 3-month programs, Peter?
They're all varied. Yeah, all varied. So I think somewhere like Kadesh, I think they have some arbitrary sort of lengths of stay, but it's kind of quite flexible depending on individual need. You're totally right around somewhere like Who's, they have those different stages, but then I think they also have houses in the community, and yeah, they all vary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one thing, going back to my own research, going back to before some people watching this were born, not you, I suspect. We found in some of our work of ATOS, the Australian Treatment Outcomes Study, that length of stay and graduation were two quite different things, and that the impact of a cake day and a graduation was a very important marker in and of itself.
It's a milestone.
Yes, yes. Now, we've got a question. We've got a question here from Robert Graham. No, I suppose evidence where resi rehabs have significant changes in outcome in the months post-rehab. Does it lead to longer term reductions? I mean, certainly that's what we found with ATOS, but I mean, in your work and looking at the systematic reviews, what's the sort of longer term outcomes?
Yeah, so your ATOS study is probably like getting to the longest follow-ups of any study, and my understanding
follow-up at the moment.
What was it? Sorry, what?
20-year follow-up.
Which is, so I think you'd be better placed to. Most of our follow-ups are 6 months and maybe 12 months, and I think that's what's mostly in those review articles. And yeah, like changes are maintained for participants, but it's a proportion of participants. What are you finding in the ATOS?
Look, what we find, well, I mean, it's too early to look at the results now, but what we find is that people, well, one, they go through a whole range of different types of treatments. So one of the questions that's being asked there, it's very hard. You can't attribute treatment one event 20 years later. But I think what we are finding, Peter, is that some people, there's different trajectories. And there are some people should never lose hope. We have large proportions of people who 20 years later are not using, they were heroin users, are happier, healthier. And I suppose, look, my view has always been all treatment's good. And you use the term treatment dose, which is an important term. But I think one thing we have to be wary of is if you have a treatment episode, whether that be any type of treatment, and 10 years down the track, well, a lot happens in 10 years. So your 3 months, you can probably say this is to do with treatment, but 20 years later, you're looking at a life trajectory.
Sure.
Rad here says, you're looking at the prems, it'd be fascinating to see some of the output, the services, interventions you've spoken. It'd be interesting to see for community IOD services as well, that they may be, would you agree that they may be applicable to outside of resi rehab format?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Healthy Recovery Program in particular would work really well in an outpatient setting. The pre-mat, so the prem that we developed, we're just sort of in the final stage of an honours project where we've surveyed everyone at Odyssey House, and that's included residential component and people in who are also attending in outpatient setting. So we're just doing some sort of evaluation around that at the moment. There's a couple of questions that just don't kind of quite fit if you're not in a residential facility, but I suspect the majority of the questions do. Yeah.
I've got a question here from Katie Sam, who prefaces it with fantastic talk, and Dr. Fidel Pettit from New South Wales Health has a great job, Pete. Thanks.
Thank you.
Peter, you're slaying them. You had 185 people watching, 190 people. Katie says, and it's a very good question, are you aware of whether outcomes vary when there are external motivators to enter treatment? And what she's talking about, for instance, compulsory treatment from a statutory agency or such, the justice system, or so the motivation to enter treatment, I suppose, is the issue here.
So I'm digging into the deep recesses of my mind. My understanding,
pretty deep recesses, Peter.
Don't take this as gospel, but my understanding is that where there are those external motivators to get people into treatment, it helps get them to treatment, and they potentially stay there longer because there are those folks, and they tend to have as good outcomes as people that have kind of chosen to go there. That's my very limited understanding, but that could be debunked.
Yeah, well, it's also part of the problem in getting studies like that. We just haven't had big enough numbers. But I mean, it goes back to people enter treatment for a whole lot of different motivations, and it may be, for instance, an external pressure at the behest of their family.
Absolutely.
So Siobhan Singh, who's a regular viewer as pharmacist, thank you for the presentation. Would you have any thoughts how residents can be supported after they leave resi rehab? Is there? You mentioned AA and NA. I know some agencies like whose have halfway, quarter-way houses, but
I think the takeaway message from this continuing care study that we did is that people have different needs, and so I absolutely mutual support I think is important. Residential rehabs do a really good job at promoting things like 12-step approaches. Maybe not as great a job at presenting alternatives, and 12-step. There's some strong studies and Cochrane reviews that support it, but isn't necessarily for everyone. So things like smart recovery could be promoted for longer term as a treatment option.
Yes.
And then I think it's just coming back to the individual, like really thinking what might be helpful on a sort of a case by case basis. I don't think that there's a one size fits all approach, but sort of working with case managers in residential rehab, and then kind of linking them into what suits them in the community, I think is helpful.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's one of the strongest things you're pointing out about. There's no one size fits all, and I think the point you made about for people looking at treatment, looking at the different options and making informed choices, not only between modalities, but even within modalities. I think that's crucial.
Absolutely.
William Gregg makes a point. It actually follows on with something you just said, really. Some rehabs will not accept people who are prescribed opiate substitution, for example, or indeed even psychotropic meds. How can these units be? Basically, how can we encourage a more integrated approach to treatment, I think, is William's general question.
Yeah, so I'm absolutely not an expert in this area, but my understanding, when I first started working in rehabs, it was very much not allowed to take medications, or it was very kind of reduced down what medications could be used across the board. I don't think that's still the case now. I think there's a lot more flexibility in residential services in that area. But not an expert in terms of what's specifically happening at the different units around. But I think the sector has improved.
One thing I would say that, and I know my British colleagues would agree, and American colleagues, there's a lot more. If you look at the situation in a place like the United Kingdom, where you have drug-free and other treatments, and they just don't talk to each other. Well, that's an exaggeration, but you know what I mean. I think Australia is blessed by having a very interactive treatment system that people do, and the users themselves, I'm thinking of heroin users, but people who are seeking treatment, they move freely to where they want to go or where they need at the time. So I think the question, you're absolutely right. And the reality is people will go to a range of services, and services need to be integrated to make that as easy as possible, because treatment's good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And just letting people know that they do have some choice, I think is an important message to pass on to this population as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's a strength of the Australian system.
It is the strength of the Australian system. Now, Richard Cook says, enjoy the presentation. And he loves that the analysis of outcomes is like life, chaotic and unpredictable and full of hidden variables that emerge without announcement. I totally agree, Richard.
I don't love that. I don't love that.
You should keep that as a quote for your research career. Here, Julia Lappin, who's works with us and is in psychiatry. Wonderful talk, Peter. Great to see data about follow-up phone calls following discharge being valuable. Julia works with young people with psychosis. Another example of how important it is to provide good continuity in care between the inpatient and outpatient community setting. Should we thought about ways to enable implementation of this? How do we change? And by the way, I think this is also true for other people leave methadone or buprenorphine are in the same situation. I suppose, Julie, how do we embed that sort of integration into treatment?
In short, I don't have the magic answer, but I think being a bit more proactive in how we manage those relationships. I think if we keep focusing on residential, I think they can tend to be a little insular, that they provide sort of a one-stop shop for lots of things, and there kind of isn't the need to talk to other services quite as much. And I think it's breaking down some of those barriers from the rehabs and really proactively engaging with those other services, having case managers or counsellors or whatever they're called, really supporting that.
Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say in the chat, I can see that Clifford has been asking about First Nations people involved in.
Shut up. Yeah, please.
That's all right. I'll just talk to that. So I haven't presented.
Clifford said how many mainstream resi rehabs had First Nation workers that are employed to offer cultural support for the audience?
The short is I'm not quite sure of the answer to that question. I was just going to say that I mentioned at the end of the presentation this idea of benchmarking and services doing some benchmarking.
Yes.
We worked pretty closely with the Glen around looking at their data and benchmarking that against both other Aboriginal community controlled organisations and mainstream organisations. And we're sort of in the editorial process at the moment. We're addressing some feedback from the editors. But the take-home message from that, and I guess specifically for the Glen, was their outcomes were as good, if not slightly better, than the other mainstream services, but they took a much higher proportion of Aboriginal people into their treatment. And so in terms of support for Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, I think as a research field, it's still developing in drug and alcohol treatment, but I think that's a really positive outcome for the Glen and for Aboriginal controlled organisations a bit more broadly.
Absolutely, and Clifford, thank you for picking that up, Peter. I'm trying to juggle a lot of things here, but it's incredibly important.
Oh, good.
We're just coming. I'll just ask one more question from Danny Baxter. Thank you, Peter. Mentioned that residents were more than willing to give feedback, good, bad, and everything in between. Any common themes, what residents really liked or really didn't like?
Well, just something I haven't mentioned as part of this presentation, but this idea of people like staff members having their own lived experience of addiction, it came through in every one of the interviews that I attended and was just spoken about with a lot of passion. It felt like that there was consensus in each of the focus groups that we ran about just the importance, not every staff member having their own lived experience, but they really valued that. That was something that really kind of came through.
Yes.
As one example.
Yeah. And I'll just finish. I think you've answered, well, Emily Dugway, I'm sorry, Emily, I'm not quite sure the pronunciation. Did your research cover services were both rural and metro? The Glen is on the Central Coast, is it not? I can't remember.
Glenn's on the Central Coast.
Far Central
We
Coast.
haven't published it, but we did some feasibility studies of the healthy lifestyle intervention in Alice Springs and Mount Isa,
okay.
and the results were comparable with what we found in the main trial. So we should really get to writing up those results.
No, that's quite important.
Yeah.
Because quite too often, I think, due to resource constraints, research tends to be city-centric, but there's a whole world out there. Look, that's an absolutely exceptional range of questions, as I've no doubt you see, Peter. I do like the hidden variables of life coming out to attack you at any given time. I think we all know what that feels like. Peter, that was an exceptional presentation, and it's a terrific body of work. And it's been a real pleasure to have you here today and to have a very large audience watching and engaging with you. And I wish you all the best for your future work.
Oh, thank you. And thanks again for the invitation and people sticking around and asking questions. Really appreciate it. Don't hesitate to reach out if I could pass anything on to anyone.
Excellent. And he's also a gun bass player too, by the way, if anyone needs a bass player in their band. And to the audience out there, I'd just like to say thank you for watching today and for your excellent array of questions. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of your afternoon and an excellent evening. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Peter. See you later.
Thanks, everyone.